We're recording this as always. My name's Scott Knight. I'm an assistant superintendent with the Department of Education. Jennifer is not with us, taking some time off this week. I'm joined by Ashley, Alex, Shondine Garcia, and Alexa Pearson, and all of you, and a lot of knowledge. We don't have a slide deck for today, but I'll share a couple quick things about this space. One, feel free if you want to say hi in the chat, and we'll use the chat rapidly. Ashley will probably put something in there that gives you a way to sign in or know that you're here. Is that right, Ashley? And it's great if you don't already, although most of you do, adjust your name on your Zoom so that we all know how to call each other. And the goal of the office hours is really to support mostly kind of informal learning. We've often brought a topic. I want to announce one for next week, and then use the rest of the time for more fluid Q&A. For this week, we're really just going to do pretty fluid open Q&A. So I'll give you a prompt in a minute for the chat to help get us started, and then we'll open things up. We're also joined this week for the first time by a couple colleagues from the Oregon Health Authority. Kristen Hollywood is on with us. And Kristen, is anyone else on with you today? Lee is here. Lee Peters is here. And they're going to begin to join us on a regular basis. Today is a little bit of a warm up, like what the heck is this office hours thing kind of thing. But going forward, they'll be able to also help answer questions in real time, and thought it would be a helpful way to kind of bridge between the two agencies. So we're excited about that. Shondine, Alex, Ashley, Alexa, anything else in the opening? No? All right. Thanks for the introductions going on in the chat. We appreciate that. Oh, thanks, Karina, for being here. So the prompt I'll give you before we will just go kind of fairly wide open, and we'll use the Q&A and the chat to roll through questions that people have, is when you think about the next 6 to 8 weeks, when you think about the next 6 to 8 weeks, what is the information that you most need that you feel like you don't have? So kind of a short-term focus. And then the second prompt, so you can kind of like zoom in short-term. And then the other prompt would be like long-term, zoom out. If you think about the next 6 to 8 months, like what's on the horizon that you might have questions about. We may not be able to answer all those. You can code those in the chat by putting short-term ST and then like your question or thought, and you can put the long-term in by LT and on top. But we want to give a little range to what we're talking about, so we're not just being immediately reactive. And with that, we'll open it up. We don't have any specific headlines. This is really just a chance to field problems of practice, questions you have, or help support sharing. I guess I will make my one announcement for next week to pre-tune, and we'll put an announcement about this out as well. But we're next Monday going to focus on screening at the door of school buildings. We've talked with reopening advisors about that. We've heard lots of different stories and examples about the ways in which we can write all the guidance in the world that we want. You got folks actually at the moment at a door, and you've got all the challenges of trying to sort out what happens in that interaction. What's the guidance say you're supposed to do? What happens when someone appears to have symptoms that would make it think that whoever that custodian, sacred person who has the job of determining who comes in the building or not, how do they handle that interaction when you got 4, 5, 6 buildings, 12 buildings in a district? How are you handling that? We talked a little bit about just some sharing of training materials. I'm going to try to bring some things around carefrontation. How do you thoughtfully communicate with people where there's boundaries? We're going to try to do a little sharing that way. So we'll dedicate a good chunk of our next Monday specifically to that, because we think that it's really critical at this moment in time. And so know that, and we'll share that. And with that, we'll just start going through short-term and long-term feedback and questions, and everyone will help out in the chat. First one that I spot is, let's see, actually, oh, you guys got all kinds of good stuff in here. All right.
I think the first couple were on the safe harbor.
Yeah, is that Scott? The other Scott Lindenberger? Oh, that looks like it's on test positivity. Okay, tell me about safe harbor, Alexa. We'll do that, and then we'll do Scott's question on test positivity.
Okay, so from Patty says, clarify safe harbor and the intent of its inclusion in the guidance.
Great. So the intention of the safe harbor clause was a kind of grandmother effect to say, if you were previously working under the exceptions in the prior framework, before the new one was released, that you could stay in those exceptions as long or until January 4th. And you could stay past January 4th if you weren't in the red CDL far right over 200,000 cases position. But that when it comes to that moment in time, both on test positivity or case count or case rate, that when you hit January 4th, that framework then does cut through and no longer allow for that exception. So the exceptions in the prior framework, those exceptions could be true no matter how high numbers got. You're basically, the exception was an exception fully away from the metrics and framework. And the point of the safe harbor clause was to say, there's going to come a point in time, we're going to give you a lot of notice, but when it comes to January 4th, if you are in that far right red CDL column, then you have to come out of your exception and into CDL, even if you had an exception prior, except if you have an exception under the new framework, right? Which is different. So that was the intent. Does that clarify conceptually?
How does emergency childcare status affect what you just said?
Emergency childcare is under the early learning division. It doesn't respond to the Ready Schools metrics. There might be interplay that are important to talk about, but it's not an immediate mover at the moment. Now, the ELD is, I understand, revisiting or looking at their metrics that relates to the governor's metrics, and there may be changes. I can't speak to those, although we could certainly bridge things to ELD, but I can't, there's nothing more there right now.
So Scott, the interplay you're talking about is if you have a couple of hours of LIPI and the rest of your day is emergency childcare, we might still be able to continue to do emergency childcare, but after January 4th, LIPI is going to be all bets are off.
Not exactly accurate. LIPI is allowed even in the, although there is a cash caution. So if you go to maybe one of my colleagues will put the Ready Schools, either the visual framework or the zero section in the table, in the details of the table, we basically say, if you get to far right, the far right column, CDL, red, very high risk, you should really think about whether you should continue LIPI or not. And we name some provisions, but it is the one thing that can continue to universally be done if the conditions are good to do so, even in that situation. And so to answer your question, you could potentially then kind of proceed in that way. Now, whether you can and whether you should are different questions, but the framework's built on, like, the state builds the framework and says what we think meets the general parameters, and then within that framework leaves for some local decision making. There are some public health authorities that in their counties have said, we don't think you should do this at all, including limited in person. And we would encourage you to listen to your local public health authority if they've issued that kind of message. Lee or Kristen, you don't have to be on the spot. I told you could just audit and listen, but feel free to jump in at any time if I say something that's not tracking for you.
Also, on the safe harbor question, it feels like Patty said yes, that answered it, but Scott Lindenberger had a longer one, and I want to make sure Scott's Scott L's question was fully answered by
Okay.
yours, Scott
Yeah.
and I. I'm going to read it out loud, and then Scott L in the chat, you can tell me if we've gotten it. The latest Lane County numbers, red for county case rate and green for county test positivity. If this is what came out on January 4th, could we as a district continue operating under CDL K3 exception safe harbor and limited in-person instruction grades 412 as we've been doing since September 1? Or since we're in the red zone under the county case rate, we revert to limited in-person only with the provisions we're not seeing an outbreak in this part of the county.
It'll be a good test for Scott to see, but the one part of my answer I didn't say that is important is you do, for the whole framework, it is county test positivity plus case rate or case count, whichever applies. Both have to be meeting, whichever one is the more conservative, like threshold is where you fall. So in the case that Scott's talking about, just because you got a green on test positivity, when you're, in this case rate is in the red, then you're in the red, right? And you then have to respond that way. Now the limited in person could continue, but the K3 exception would need to move out now, which hopefully more directly answers it, Scott, but let us know if not.
And then
That's not what I wanted to hear, but thank you.
I understand, that's part of my job.
Yeah.
Is to say lots of things that people don't like. But
Right
it's
on.
important to try to be clear, yeah.
can you, and this isn't out yet, we know, Scott, but can you talk a little bit about the tension in the calculating of the positivity rates and the new way and how they might impact the metrics?
Yeah, so you may have, or you may not have heard that the way that the Oregon Health Authority is publishing and tracking what makes up the test positivity rate is changing, and we expect that today's new report will come with both the explanation and the change to this new methodology. Despite what's in the news media coverage of it, I understand that this was something that was well in the works for a very long time and unfortunately came, oh, hi, Dr. Seilinger, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but came at a time that unfortunately makes it have political layers, but was really about a methodology change that was hoped for a while. And the fundamental change is instead of tracking test positivity tied to a person, so I'm a person in a county, I might get 10 COVID tests over time. In the prior methodology, I would still only show up as one result tied to the person. The new methodology is by the test. So each of those 10 tests, positive or negative, which would make the result. And that's a number that is makes it so that it tracks, kind of basically every response. It will diminish the kind of spiking based on population and more match the actual testing amount happening. For those of you in small counties who have had concerns about the safe harbor clause January 4th and test positivity, this won't change the spread of the virus, but we think it's a more accurate measure of test positivity, but it is a change. And so you'll see in the report that you'll see test positivity will feel like it's come down. You really need to think about it like you got to recalibrate the numbers, but we believe our metrics framework holds up to that change. So that's the short version, and OHA colleagues feel free to correct me if you feel like I messed any of that up. But it's a big changer and it's getting a lot of attention.
Let's have Dr. Seidlinger.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you did really well, Scott. I don't know. The school metrics we posted today are using the new percent positivity. I don't know if we put an explainer at the beginning of that. So let me look to see where we have a posted explainer. So if you watched the press conference from last week, Dr. Sutton did a really good job, but I won't make you sit through that. So we'll try and post something. But as Scott said, we've been talking about this for a while. Early on, we tested mostly people in the hospital. And so someone sitting in the hospital often got tested every day, waiting for a negative test to come back so they could go to a skilled nursing facility. And we didn't want to count all of those tests. And so, the individuals-based system really worked through about September when the numbers, if we tracked individuals testing positive versus tests that were positive were fairly similar. They diverged a little bit in September up to about 2%. And then really in October, when the cases started going up, we saw that huge divergence. So not trying to kind of hide anything or make things look better, just trying to be more inclusive of the tests that are out there, knowing that, let's say last month, my husband tested positive. So as a household contact, I would have sought out testing. You know, I avoided him like the plague and, you know, tested negative. And so I have a negative test. But then let's say I hear a colleague that I worked with that I spent some time with in a meeting tested positive. I go in to get testing again. Me seeking testing really represents a new exposure for me, and we should be recounting that. So that's what we're doing. We're recounting all of those negative tests. Almost every county should have seen drops, some fairly significantly, and we're going to continue calculating this going forward. As the governor develops her new kind of metrics for risk, it also uses these parameters. And so we are making sure that we harmonize those. But yes, the new metrics are up, and I'll try and find a posted explainer and send it out to all you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Seidlinger. And then one other thing I'll pick up from, I think it's Roque. We are not changing, there will be no corresponding change in the metrics framework, just to be explicit, like to answer that question in the chat. All right.
Yeah,
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I wanted to open it up for really any deep questions on that test positivity information you all just got from Scott and Dr. Seidlinger, because I know there are questions and I don't want to wait if we're on it right now. And so the first one is from Dr. Barnworth. I support the initial methodology for test positivity and the switch to the new methodology. So not a question, but an offer of support. So appreciate that. From Sarah Pope, looks like all the previous increments on test positivity were recalculated too. Is that accurate?
For the school metrics, those are switching over. We haven't switched over all of the other data visualizations, but we will be switching over to the new percent positivity over time. It's taking us a little, it's a heavy lift for our IT and FE team, but they will all be switching over to the new metric.
It looks like they were. Everything looks lower now. So I'm just wondering if I'm just misremembering or.
I think he was trying to say,
Yeah.
Sarah, that they have been for schools, but they aren't for many other sectors. They'll be working to get them all. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there's a dashboard of county percent positivity that's separate for school metrics that last time I looked hadn't been recalculated. I think that one is probably coming in the next week. So, but if you just look at schools, yeah, previous ones all got recalculated on the school, data that was posted today.
And could you speak to the way other states are calculating positivity? Concerned that it maybe make it hard to compare state to state based on different methodologies?
And so it is currently hard to compare different states' methodologies. And I just looked in the chat, I spelled Peter's name wrong, so sorry, Peter. But the kind of both ways are accepted by the CDC. And initially, I think many states were doing the individual based. But as time went on, they realized, as did we, that they may not be counting all the tests and it may not be as reflective of the situation on the ground. So for example, Washington State switched over about 2 months ago. And I think there's still a mix of states, but most I think have switched over to more of a test-based metric, which is where we are now. There may still be a few that are individual-based metric, but some of our friendly neighborhood data consolidators, I think Johns Hopkins in particular, doesn't distinguish between the methods and lumps them both together. So it's an apples to oranges comparison. But if you compare us to Washington State, we're using similar metrics. And I believe California is also using an individual metric. So you could compare us to them.
Thank you. In hopes to triage a little bit some of the questions, I want to make sure the short-term questions get addressed. So I'm going to go with those first. And then Scott, come back at you with the longer term ones, if that's okay.
That sounds great. Thank you for the help.
Of course. So first, short term from James, any chance there's an apples to apples case rate for Oregon schools that we can compare with our county rate? it seems the sector-specific rate could help to show how schools are doing.
And James, can you unmute and just say a little more what you mean? I want to make sure I understand before we answer.
Yeah, can you hear me, Scott?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just curious because we're getting the rates about, in schools, like 65,000 students have been in some sort of in-person or something since the beginning of school. And we've tracked like 100 cases or something according to Colt between students and staff this fall. So I was curious, people are, in general, we're tracking these county rates per 100,000, and I know the total school population would be lower, but I'm curious if there's a way to create a rate that says, hey, this is how schools are doing as compared to society at large.
I understand now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
Yeah. OHA colleagues, I don't feel like you need to respond to that. I would say you can feel free to. I think it's a kind of thing that we could go and ask about or think about the logistics of doing. I think in the part of what, as with all of you, part of what this requires is like of 100,000 things you could do, what are the 10 or 20 you must do in terms of focus. I do think it could be interesting to do it well and in a way that would be consistent across all 197 districts, and to include private schools would be a fairly big logistical undertaking. And in the scheme of things, we'll probably prioritize connections with public health authority and contact tracing and test availability, but it's not worth not thinking about, or to think about if there's methods or ways to gather that kind of information. Dean or OHA, anything you want to add to that?
No, I would just say, I think that luckily there's been fairly few cases that doing case rates would probably be not that meaningful. I mean, you could look at a percentage of cases in your county that were associated with the school, but luckily what we're seeing is most cases that we see introduced to schools, we're not seeing spread. We're seeing very limited spread in schools. So these are just cases in the community that happen to be a student or happen to be a teacher and attend school. But then when we do our investigations, we're not finding very much spread. And that's a testament to the work you guys are doing implementing Ready Schools Safe Learners. Because I think schools are a relatively safe place in terms of transmission.
James, tell me if I'm wrong, but my guess is that the line of question is almost to that point, like public confidence about kids going to school with upward county rates might be buoyed if they had a measure that showed them that the rate of spread in school, because of all the protocols and the following, might make them go, okay, just because county rates are high doesn't mean that spread in schools. So I don't know, James, if that was your thinking, but my hunch is that's kind of where you're headed. Yeah.
Yep, that's it. I mean, we all know our parents only see the community rates, and that's the cause for alarm. And there's nothing, it's hard to, we do all keep saying what everyone is saying, which is we're doing a great job with all of our health and safety practices in schools. And yet there's sort of a piece of data that would be great. And thanks so much for the answer and for all the work that you were doing. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and we'll definitely track it as a question to ask more about. So thanks. All right.
From Brian Gardner, short term, mainly for Dr. Seidlinger. I am in-person K-3 and doing limited in-person 4 through 12, grandfathered in till January, but Lynn County is at 213/100,000 100K. We have had no infections. Pressure to stay open and to close is getting hot. OHA's take on this?
I think we continually look at the data and what we learn under the current metrics. If those numbers held true January 4th, the requirement would be for comprehensive distance learning. As we continue to look through on spread in communities, we've also heard the pressure from both sides about, keep schools open, they're doing great, close schools down, you're going to see a lot more COVID. I think we're continue to look at this as we go, finish out November, but really into December, and can talk, does it make sense to revisit this? We last revisited the metrics in October. We don't want to open them up continuously, but if it remains true that we're not seeing spread in schools, then potentially a relaxation or revisiting of the hard close could be an order. That's not something I make alone, or that Colt makes alone. We would consider community input and then have discussions with our policymakers and see if everyone agrees. So I'm going to leave myself some room to continue to revisit that. But right now, you would close.
Thank you. Back to you, Scott, and on travel advisory versus requirement executive order. If the governor does not make the travel advisory an executive order, under what authority do schools have the ability to exclude students if they or their family have traveled out of state for pleasure?
Would you read it one more time?
Of course. So it's travel advisory versus requirement executive order. If the governor does not make the travel advisory an executive order, comma, under what authority do schools have the ability to exclude students if they or their family have traveled out of state for pleasure? This isn't for work.
So I think want to make sure people broadly have the communication that we sent out. Shundeen, can you put that, or someone grab that in the chat? And we speak to the travel advisory and talk through essentially how to think about that as it relates to students or families in that Q&A. When it comes to what formal authority, if it's not an executive order, I don't know. I don't know if my OHA colleagues know, otherwise I can take that as a take-home assignment, but I don't know if it's not forthcoming. Dean, do you know more?
Yeah, I will say, so the travel advisory is just that advisory. I've not heard any talk about making it more formal guidance or adding it into an executive order. It would be difficult to enforce. So I think the messaging that went out from ODE about educating people about the guidance and the recommendation to self-quarantine when they come back is appropriate. I don't think there's an enforceable mechanism for exclusion unless additional guidance was written, and I don't know that we have the cover with existing executive orders to do that.
Thanks. And the one thing I would say from a practitioner perspective is, and Shundeen's now put that communication in the chat, is the call for that, if we come back to, I understand to be hard. And so, but the call for that is basically that people will take the self-governing practice to quarantine when they go do those things to keep other people safe. And so where you don't have, and this would be a great kind of role play for next week, like where you don't have formal state authority and can't force someone, but you have concern about what they might be risking in terms of the community, how do you approach that? But I also understand that schools need that kind of clear line. Like, is this something you're requiring me to do and I have to enforce? Or is this something that's advice and for now, and it sounds like for the foreseeable future, that lives as like an advisory, like, don't drive up the mountain without putting your snow chains on. And we hope people will follow it, and you'll point people towards that.
Scott, can I just add in just for a sec? We talked to our lawyer about this, and the whole thing about advisory versus required. In regards to a private school, deciding whether or not a staff member traveled either for Thanksgiving or Christmas, and then came back and self-quarantined for 14 days, as to whether or not a private school would be required to pay that person who chose to go on that vacation, right? And we understand people want to see their family. And we were advised that we would not need to do so as long as it was still an advisory. But as soon as it became required, that it might be a different story. So if you're thinking about adding this to the list for the agenda for next week, I think the topic of paying staff ought to be added, as well as it's not just kids that we're asking to self-quarantine, it's our staff as well.
Okay, we can track that. Thanks, Glenn.
Yep.
All right, Shondine, where are we at?
Yep, short-term question. Are LTCT required to complete the weekly school report with the current instructional model and any cases of COVID?
So for now, no, they are not formally required, and we're not tracking it in that way. If you have specific questions about that, or there might be one facility that is because they find it valuable to do so, but it is not formally a requirement. But Blake Whitson, I'll put his email in the
I got it.
okay, in the chat if you have follow-up questions related to the, here I want to be clear, we're talking about the weekly school status report. This kind of auto pings folks for their status, and thank you all for the effort. It's been going quite well, the information flow on that. So
Next up, a question on performing arts. So that performing arts guidance for schools, requirements versus recommendation for in-person instruction.
yeah, great. There's both requirements and recommendations. When you go to the Ready Schools page, and I'll do a quick screen share just to walk people through this. Here I'm at the Ready Schools website. I'm going to click the guidance on the top left. I'm going to go to the main Ready Schools document. And I'll just scroll down, and here we have the instructional and extracurricular activities requiring additional consideration, 5F. And when I go there, there's this sub list of guidance. So here's the visual and performing arts. It got updated in the 4.0 launch, and I click it, and now it's giving me the guidance. And here I have the requirements and I have the recommendations. I'll toss that link in the chat since I have it up, but it's absolutely both, and may continue to get revised. This particular area of work is, we know each of the ones in this RSSL document where we've listed them are essentially things that we know are important but higher risk. I'll stop my screen share. And that kind of like wind makes sense if you think about the virus coming through breath. If you have bigger, deeper and you're basically singing or yelling or musical instruments, there's more concern about risk and spread. And so it's very specific, but it's both. And they have the force of RSSL in terms of needing to follow them.
Okay, we've handled all the short-term ones. I'm going to move to 3 long-term ones, and then 3 that don't have any indication, but if we've got the time, it'd be nice if we could answer them.
Okay.
So the first long-term one is, do we have any information about whether teachers will be required to get a vaccine once it becomes available?
Great question. So I welcome anyone on the call who has either knowledge or thoughts about this. I would say that I am not aware of any action one way or the other. I do have Dr. Seidlinger, OHA colleagues can speak more to there is some work being done to think through, and one of the things your weekly status report does is help prepare us for eventually thinking about distribution, and there is some possibility, I'm not sure as we get closer to that being real, how that will play. I think there is some possibility that schools will be important sites of distribution, but it's not totally clear yet, so don't plan anything off of that. So there's some recognition of that. There's recognition, obviously, as teachers being a high priority population, but in terms of a requirement or any logistics, I'm not aware of any of that. I appreciate the question. I don't know if Dr. Seidlinger could stay on with us. Oh, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I don't know of any kind of upcoming change that would require this for anyone. I think we're working through the best way to distribute this, and I would highly encourage teachers to get it and to have you guys be partners. So reach out to families when we do have approval for use in children. Those studies are just starting now, and so will come later. So I don't know of any statewide effort around a requirement.
The only other thought I have is in the, positive messaging and centering, which is what can we do? So I'll put this on our homework list, like what can we do in terms of preparation, information, reality, timing, in terms of like the positive momentum of like when it comes time, with what information, how do we encourage that so we can think kind of productively from a system leadership perspective about that. Brian Gardner took my thought in the chat, which I'm not sure requirement will have the most fruit for us, and we'll run into lots of other issues, but how to support that in a thoughtful way will be really important. All right, what else we got?
What happens to staff with long-term COVID complications or staff that need to take care of a long-term patient?
That's a great long-term question. I think we should all be thinking about the fall sooner rather than later. I think winter's a good time of reflection. And as we come off of it and we start hitting, it will be spring very soon, and we'll be thinking about the next school year. And it's going to be a fuzzy planning time that will be different in its architecture than last spring. But I think we'll still be pretty fuzzy in terms of like mixed media of like vaccine, but still needing to wear masks, what protocols, how much spread we'll have. We don't actually know. We're not through the winter. We need to be super humble about what's in front of us right now in this immediate time. But what planning and thought need to be made for staff with compromised illnesses or immune system in the longer term architecture. Like I think we'll have to keep that. And definitely on the ODE side, we're doing some thinking about how, when we get to January, we like recalibrate on all of these guidance documents and processes and try to think through what's ahead, so we can definitely trace the question. But I encourage everyone to be thinking about it locally too.
I assume that your response, Scott, will be a little bit the same for the next long-term question, which is assuming a vaccine is rolled out before the 21-22 school year, what plans are being made to phase things back to quote unquote normal?
Same set of thoughts. Yeah, I think, a lot of humility between here and there. I read something from a Canadian public health minister, and then I read a piece that had Dr. Fauci quoted in it. They were asking about essentially, I appreciated that instead of saying normal, they said like, their question was like, when could people not need to wear a mask around? And they were both around like next December or next spring was when they thought that would be a real thing. So I don't know, that's not my expertise. Public health folks, feel free to weigh in, but I think we definitely need to be planning for the next school year and be thinking about that. But I think we'll probably need to get through this winter, and then like we'll warm up a lot of that conversation as a system kind of January, February, March in terms of like planning and structure wise. But Dr. Seidlinger, anything more you want to add to that?
No, I would say I think we still may have some safeguards in place in the fall. I think a lot is really going to depend on how we get through this winter, and then with the uptick of vaccine, and particularly whether we're able to vaccinate students. But there may still be some level of physical distancing and mask wearing in the fall, but I'm hoping almost everyone is in person the vast majority of the time, that we're not in a position where we're really moving amongst methods. But don't hold me to that. I've not been very good at predicting the future of this pandemic to date. So, because I really thought more kids would be in school right now, back in May when I said that. So.
A question from Julie Rickman. She may need to unmute and unpack it a little bit more because I'm not quite sure who we're asking, but it's how are we measuring instructional minutes and what is the requirement when we're trying to make a hybrid plan? Julie, did you want to expand a little bit on that? Scott, you wanted to open first.
No, I was going to say, Julie, maybe say a little more, and then Alexa, maybe you can be ready to respond.
Great, thank you so much. My question really comes because I'm seeing a lot of districts elect plans where there's maybe one day off in the middle of the week, and their school day happens to be a little shorter than mine already. I'm a charter school. So just wondering, what are those actual instructional minutes that we're really shooting for? I just want to make sure we can meet that
Want me to go ahead and answer?
Yeah, please.
So the instructional minutes those are in rule. So those would be are you a K-8?
Yes.
So that's 900 hours per year. And so we've put in there in the guidance, we've kind of broken that down. We did increase the amount of hours that can be used for professional learning and for conferences. So we tripled those. So it's up to 90 for each of those. But whether you're in any of the instructional models, you still have to meet those instructional hours. The 900 minutes for K-8. If you're a high school, it's 990, or for seniors, it's 960.
Okay, thank you.
There are some things, just so you know, for K3, like recess and some pieces. And so if there's particular questions, I'll put my email in the chat, and you're welcome to email me if you have specific questions about your instructional hours.
Great, thanks, Alexa.
So we've answered the short term and the long term. I'm going to move to the others that weren't labeled, and I'll go ahead and start with you, Julie, since you were just on and near your unmute button should you need to. Her question is, if we have not started with limited in-person instruction, when can we do that? This is for Washington and Multnomah counties. Do we just watch the metrics?
All right, let me do a quick screen share again and just walk through this really quickly. So can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. So so here's the basic framework, right? And Washington and Multnomah County, two of the higher counties. So we can let me go back one step. So here I am on the ODE website. I'm going to health metrics, and I just pulled up the metrics explainer. I'll go back to that in a minute. Here's the latest metrics from OHA, and this is
actually, Scott, could you make it a little bit bigger? Just do the plus so it's a little bit. If you've on one screen, it may be. There you go. Thank you.
And so I'm just going to do a quick look at Washington and Multnomah County. So here's Multnomah County. Here's this last round. We're at a case rate of 468, and then you've got Washington County, and you're at 313, and both those test positivities with the changed method are really high. And so when you're looking here, you're basically clearly in that distance learning column, and it says implement with allowable limited in person only. And what's true is that we've basically made this statewide allowance. Let me blow this up a little more. That is available even when you're in that column. Now, Julie, that being said, you want to check with I believe I'm pretty confident Clackamas County has told its whole county they think they should not do any even limited in person, but I don't want to be, I'm not like 90, I'm not 100% certain. I know that there's been discussion with Washington, Multnomah, public health folks, feel free to weigh in, but they probably have a lot of hesitancy about now being a time you'd start because of the conditions being so high. That said, formally, from the framework perspective, if your public health is good, if you can meet these criteria, which is you've got sections 1 through 3 of the guidance in place, so all those health and safety protocols are set. You've got measures for basically thinking about good screening measures, and the planning for COVID-19 scenarios toolkit is well digested by you. Then this gets you the actual limited in-person guidance about what you can do at what cohort size with limited hours. You can actually do that even in that far right column. There's not a limitation from you starting. That doesn't mean that you should start, right? So I just be really clear about that. Public health folks, anything you want to add to that?
No, that's correct. I think being judicious with limited in-person instruction at those very high cases probably makes some sense. So not opening up fairly widely, but using it for those cases that truly need it on a very limited basis, but it is riskier in terms of introduction of cases.
If we can continue with the limited in-person instruction discussion, Greg asks, according to the guidance, If we are following the expectations presented by the guidance and have not had any cases of COVID, we can still keep serving kids, right? Is there possibly a point when the state will say no one is allowed on school grounds again?
The first part of that is correct. You can continue doing limited in person, especially if you've not seen any kind of spread or interaction. That is, I think you've heard the governor share the priority, which is to safely, following these protocols, have kids be in whatever way they can while still following this framework. I'm not aware of that conversation. Dr. Seidlinger, I don't know if you would be. I'm not aware of anything that would head down that road other than to follow our framework as it is. But I'd be the last person to, per like what Dr. Seidlinger said earlier, you can't, like, anytime you predict something is probably a bad idea in the pandemic. But anything you want to add?
No, I think, with what we currently know, unless things were kind of much, much worse, and things are pretty bad now, I wouldn't see a time when we would do a blanket kind of school closure the way that happened in March as part of Stay Home, Save Lives. I think what we can demonstrate is that, yes, more COVID in the community, we see more introduction of cases, but schools right now, even in some counties that are having more spread, are still able to control spread within the schools. So I don't know of any chatter out there about that. I think we're trying to find ways to keep more kids at lower risk back in school and to bring more kids at lower risk back into school, protecting themselves, their staff, and the families they all come home to. That's really the direction we're trying to go. And I don't see, unless it comes completely out of left field and is happening in meetings that I'm not a part of, and that ODE is not a part of, I don't see that happening anytime soon, but I'm not going to guarantee never.
I want to follow up real quick on one thing from Brian in the chat around Lynn County Health about ODE and OHA, about all decisions for opening and closing. Just to say, I understand, one, that there's, many different counties, Oregon's a big state, different public health capacities. But just to restate the way we hope it's working, which is in the authority and effective kind of section, the like opening parts of the Ready Schools document, we name what are the formal roles of all these different actors in the system, including when it comes to needing to intervene or potentially have to take measures to close. And we want to be building between the healthcare system and the education system relationships and collaboration that work at that most immediate local and regional level. Formally, public health, the local public health is invoked in lots of places to advise or consult based on their capacity. And the idea would be that school leaders, superintendents, and school boards, or private school leaders or charter school leaders, would listen to that advice and consultation. Formally, it is the school board or superintendent's decision within the state framework, but the state has overlaid this framework that says it's not all local control. Here's this set of intervention. If there's a contested situation and they can't get to alignment or agreement and there's real health and safety risks, that's where essentially there's a set of remedies through OHA, there's a set of remedies through ODE that could potentially be pursued to solve those things. We want that collaboration to happen in that proactive way. There are places where there's a little bit of schools want someone to tell them they can do something or not do something. The local public health doesn't see their role as being the ones to say yes or no, but to advise and offer consultation. Schools can experience that public health communication as kind of like fuzzy and soft and not quite as like discreet as school folks like things. And vice versa, the LPHA folks can feel like school folks are like wanting a permission slip that's a yes or no instead of thinking about mitigating risk and how to mitigate risk. And so we're trying to find ways to get these things to kind of like talk and listen to each other. It's not always perfect. And then there's really different capacities in different counties. So this is the area that gets lots of attention. Dr. Seidlinger can attest. A whole lot of our time is thinking about the relationship of districts, LPHAs, your ESD supports, and it's never more important than right now. So if there are things that feel like they're barriers, we want to hear about them. If there's positive success, that's helpful to know too, as everyone's working super hard at a pretty stressed out place at the moment, given the case rate. One last thing, if an LPHA is like, we don't have a capacity to answer, that's its own important constraint in the system. If they can't answer all the customized questions, that's because there's so much happening in the county that then you might need to go slower because they can't answer, and we should accept that as a constraint. So that's a small sermon. Dr. Seilinger, anything you want to add to that?
No, I would just add that I don't know if some of this is coming. So as busy as we've all been, kind of, reading Ready Schools, Safe Learners and making changes and setting up different schedules in response to COVID, these last few weeks have been especially hard for your local public health partners, our local public health partners. And I think, really being, they were busy and tired before, but they're just exhausted now. And so I think, some of this may be coming from a place of, we can't deal with this now and future now. And so part of having some more of us from OHA join this call and finding other opportunities for us, OHA and ODE, to work to try and support you answer through some of these questions. Yes, ultimately we want you to engage with your local public health partners, but we know that can be more challenging right now when they're busy. So trying to get you the kind of accurate and factual based information, and then push back on when kind of the conversation with local public health is more appropriate, knowing that the capacity in various systems is very constrained right now. And so I think that's part of what we all want to speak with the same voice, and we do want that local connection and ability to make decisions under the framework where it can, but we want to try and support them as well, because yeah, that's all.
We've got two final questions.
If you could give a hug to a public health person, I would say do it, but do it virtually.
Send virtual hugs. Nice. I've got two final questions, and then we will have answered actually every single question that was asked of us. So if we can make it through these last two, and they're actually from the same person. So from Brian Trendell, 1, how do the metrics and RSSL affect preschool promise preschools? And we may or may not have the answer to that right away. We may have to get back to you on that one. And then the follow-up, Scott 9, is also right there in the closest in the chat from him to clarify if we are an in-person K-3 currently within the orange zone and our county enters the red zone, we would have to wait until January 4 to move district-wide to CDL, ? No. Oh, sorry, I didn't.
No, we got it. We got it. I'm going to take them in opposite order. So Brian, you're in K3 in a county that's in that orange transition operating status. One, the framework, it tells you where you have hard stops and starts, but it doesn't override your decision-making judgment and local decision-making. So if for some reason in your community, you were to think, wow, we need to move out to CDL before the framework forces us to do it, you have the discretion to do that. I just want to be clear about that. That said, what happens on January 4th, the difference is if you were under the exception, under the old exception, you were doing K3 under the old exception, you could have continued even if you were in red right now. But come January 4th, you have to move out to CDL. That's what the Safe Harbor January 4th is about, is you can't operate out in that red category once you get to January 4th. Not that you have to wait until January 4th. So if you moved into the red now and your community thought it was not wise to continue, you could move. But January 4th, when it's no longer a local decision, you then become required to move out. On the second part on Preschool Promise is Early Learning Division, and their guidance and framework runs on a different set of frameworks and metrics and processes in terms of what's allowed under that guidance. And so you'd really refer you, maybe we can put the ELD guidance in the chat. I know they're working to do some recalibration of that, given some changes with the governor's office and the new ODE K-12 metrics, but formally choices about Preschool Promise would live under the ELD guidance.
And one last quick question that came in from Jacob. Jacob, I can help you a little bit, and so can probably Alexa. He's asking about what guidance may be coming out about pass and complete considerations. There isn't anything we aren't considering. So we just put out a quick sample study to look at credits, how many people are on track in grades 9 and 10 right now to help inform, so we can look at the numbers. We're hearing high numbers of 9th and 10th graders not potentially passing, and we know the implications for seniors potentially struggling with CDL and access and everything that's going on. So we're actually forming a small group of folks to get together to really think deeply about credit, look at numbers, look at some actual data that we have, because we don't collect it in real time. We collect it after the fact. So we're trying to collect some actual data right now and look and think deeply about what sorts of considerations are we going to need to do in the spring. So appreciate you bringing it up, because it's going to inform future conversations going forward. We are deeply considering everything that we did in the spring as well. It's 3:59.
A big thank you to Dr. Shondine Garcia, and to Ashley, and to Alex, and to Alexa, and then to Dr. Seilinger and our OHA colleagues. And then thanks to all of you for showing up and your questions and engagement. And then a reminder that next Monday, we will spend about 45 minutes really focused on talking about screening and what happens at that entry point of schools. And then we'll take about 15 minutes of broad Q&A. And so if you have folks on your teams or other folks that you think that would be a fruitful conversation, feel free to invite them. I think we cap at about 300 folks, but we'll record it and share it, but wanted to kind of workshop and really focus on that really important subject next Monday.
Thank you, everybody.
Included. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving.